Breaking news from Bolivia. The president of the country is denouncing what he calls irregular mobilization of some army units in the country's capital, La Paz. The video shows armored vehicle hitting the entrance to the Bolivian National Palace, and soldiers are entering the building. State media is reporting tanks gathering near the main square in La Paz. President Luis Arce wrote on X that democracy must be respected, and the country's former president wrote on X, a coup d'etat is brewing. Patrick Ottman is on the phone. Patrick, it sounds from what we're hearing that both political spectrum of, of the regular parties, President Morales and the current president, both of them would be very much concerned that a coup by the army is underway.
Yeah, it certainly looks like that, Richard, and it's raising the specter of the not-so-distant past here in Latin America, where troops and their commanders, when they disagreed with the democratically elected governments of their countries, would simply oust them, a lot of times with U.S. approval. But so far, we are seeing across the region immediate condemnation from the left to the government of Chile, to the right to the government of Chile, to the left here in Cuba. So just amazing to see the governments across the region reacting with this playing out minute by minute on the streets of La Paz, where you have these soldiers, some of them masked, some of them breaking down the doors of the presidential palace, and so far apparently not being opposed by either police or other military in Bolivia. And apparently the tensions between the democratically elected government of Bolivia, of Luis Arce, and the military. Some reports that there have been senior commanders who've lost their jobs in the last several days, and apparently may be angry over that. Right. And that has spilled over very, very publicly, violently, and hopefully, the violence will not get worse. But where this all goes is very unclear, because certainly the region has lost its appetite for this kind of thing.
Right. And first of all, do we know the whereabouts of the president and the safety of the president and his cabinet? But related to that, this coup, I mean, can it expect, if it is a coup, can it expect to receive support from any neighbours? Because obviously, what's the point of taking over if you become a pariah and, essentially nobody wants anything to do with you?
It's hard to see what the long-term plan is here, because of course, the president that you mentioned, Evo Morales, former president of Bolivia, he was also ousted after allegations that he had stolen an election. The police and military public rose up against him. That installed a much more right-wing government, transitional government, and there really was a crisis in Bolivia that goes to the point of this very, very divided nation. There was a democratic election that the U.S., that everyone accepted. Luis Arce is the democratically elected president of Bolivia at this moment. Everyone accepts that, like it or not, except these troops that we're now seeing essentially hammer their way into the presidential palace, apparently looking for him. We don't know what the ultimate goal is, but they have surrounded the presidential palace in the center of La Paz. As of a few minutes ago, the president was able to communicate via social media. So we don't know where he is. Certainly, if I were him, I would be keeping that. I would be keeping a low profile until order is restored, if order can be restored. I mean, is this the entire armed forces that has risen up, or is this just a certain group, a certain commander that are upset, that are acting on their own, and so far are not being opposed? We don't know. This is playing out minute by minute, and certainly for many people in the region, the hope was this was the past. Right. That military is rising up against democratically elected governments, that was not going to repeat, because it's happened so many times throughout Latin America. And yet here we are, 2024, watching this play out, mostly on social media, as it appears that a coup d'etat is underway in Bolivia.
The history of coups in your part of the world where you are, just about every country seems to have had one at some point. But as you rightly point out, they are slightly out of vogue at the moment. Other neighbours, international organisations, don't really encourage them, let alone encourage those who then who then support them.
No, that's right, Richard. We've seen President Boric in Chile, who's really, sort of the left middle of the spectrum, criticize this. The very far left here in Cuba, where I am, and beyond. So you've seen governments of all stripes come out. The OAS has come out, which is usually more to the right wing of the spectrum. Luis Almagro has come out condemning this. Certainly it's hard to imagine the Biden administration is going to have any kind words for the military rising up and essentially trying to force out a democratically elected president of a country in South America, of Bolivia. And the Luis Arce has not been as radical as Evo Morales. He's obviously to the left. There's no denying that. But there's also no denying that there was a clean election that was held. He's president. He's recognized by the U.S., by every other country in the region. So what the game plan is here, maybe you would hope that this is just an attempt to pressure the government, but it's already gone too far if they're breaking windows, if they're holding the main square in La Paz essentially hostage, masked armed gunmen. This is something that could lead to much greater violence if it's not contained very quickly.
And Patrick, if this follows as the formula that we often see with a coup, no doubt at some point the internet will be cut off, at some point communications will be cut off, and at some point some general will appear on television to claim that it was all being done in the name of the people and that they were rescuing them from whatever. I mean, that's if this is, and I don't mean to be flippant when I say, if this is a good old-fashioned South American, Latin American, Central American coup, that's the way it'll go.
But the fact it hasn't really speaks volumes about perhaps the planning and the long-term success of this. That the fact that we're watching the images on social media, that the internet, and of course I'm not there, but the internet appears to be working for many people, and that Bolivian journalists are doing their job quite admirably in getting out the information as well as they can. Speaks to the fact that this coup or uprising or whatever you want to call it, it does not have all the elements they would need, because you want to have that information blackout immediately. And yet we are watching and seeing updates second by second, new images coming in, and that probably says a lot about what could happen here and the lack of total control.
I have to say, Patrick, I loved your phrase. Talk about that you are the master of the understatement, taking things a bit too far, which I think sums up exactly, because this is nasty, Patrick. This is nasty.
It's going to end poorly for somebody, obviously there's been a fight brewing between the military and the civilian leadership in Bolivia now, going on some time now. You have typically right-wing elements in the military, and they've been unhappy with the left-wing leadership. But hard to see how this ends well for the people who are trying to take control of the country at the point of a gun.
Patrick Altman, who's in Cuba watching events, and we'll be back to you the moment there is more to report. Thank you.